Previously, on the history and evolution of Dragon Ball games.
The history of Dragon Ball games continues on the SNES, where a new fighting game series emerged and their Gokuden series evolved. Also, new consoles are arriving. The Genesis, the Playdia, the Sega Saturn, and the first PlayStation are just around the corner.
After 6 games of the Gokuden series on the NES, it was time to move on to the next console. Bandai released their first game on the SNES, picking this series back up with Super Saiyan Legend. This would be the last game in the Gokuden series. It was essentially a remake of the first 2 Dragon Ball Z games, taking you from the Saiyan saga all the way to the end of the Namek saga. This would not only be the last Gokuden game, but also the last Dragon Ball RPG for a while, as Bandai was trying out a new genre, fighting games. Dragon Ball Z Super Butöden started out a new series on the Super Nintendo, a series that would become so popular that it would transition to next generation consoles down the road, with a total of 9 games released up to date. It started simple, with a total of 13 playable characters, and each character had unique special moves and super moves. Characters could fly up in the air, as the screen would become split when characters distanced themselves too much. And despite its slow pace and floaty controls, it became the best-selling Dragon Ball game up to this point, thus cementing the future of this franchise in the fighting game genre. Super Butöden 2 added some features like the ability to charge your ki in the middle of battle, and its story mode ended up becoming very popular because it had many variations. Winning or losing a battle would alter the course of the story, which means players could spend a lot of time discovering the different outcomes. And Super Butöden 3 gave us characters from the Buu saga. It added a tournament mode, but this mode actually replaced the story mode, which wasn't a very popular decision. Still, with a refreshed roster of characters and the improvements to gameplay, the series kept evolving. Even Nintendo's rival console got a Butöden game, with the Dragon Ball Z Call of Destiny, which came out on the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. A game very similar to the Super Butöden games, with a different story for each playable character, again encouraging replayability in addition to just playing the game with your friends. And this game closed the Butöden series for this generation, but its popularity would carry it over to the next one in the future. Dragon Ball fighting games were just getting started, and the Butöden series was far from over. Having established those Dragon Ball fighting games, Bandai looked to diversify its portfolio and spread out across other platforms. First, trying it out on their own console, the Bandai Playdia. If you remember the last NES game of the Gokuden series, it was the first Dragon Ball game that told an original story at that point. The plan to eradicate the Saiyans. That story gave birth to 2 original animations with the same name, which would be remastered more than 10 years later to the movie that most of you probably know nowadays, Dragon Ball: Plan to Eradicate the Super Saiyans. The original OVA was broken into 2 parts, one on the Earth and another one on an alien planet, and Bandai's Playdia got a game for each one of those parts. Both of these games were very simple, as the console itself was sold more of a multimedia center, not so much as a gaming console, so a lot of the games released over there were educational titles. And these Dragon Ball games followed that format. You would select a few dialogue options, locations, you would guide the story along by choosing the correct options. So the game itself wasn't impressive, but it did spawn a new movie and a new villain, so its impact was definitely huge in the universe of Dragon Ball. But that wasn't the only experiment. Bandai also released a very different game over on the TurboGrafx. Son Goku Legend was a mix of a fighting game with a turn-based battle. You didn't have full control over your character. Instead, you used one button to put your character on the offensive and another button to put your character on the defensive. You would choose a stance that would boost the damage you deal or the damage you take. And if you win this action phase, you then get to attack your opponent during the damage phase, which is when all the special moves happen. A very weird concept that didn't play very well, but the game looked really good at the time. It was probably the best looking Dragon Ball game so far. But leaving that weird experiment aside, Bandai went back to familiar ground, returning Dragon Ball to the RPG genre with the rise of the original Game Boy. Bandai wanted to bring the franchise to the rising phenomenon in the handheld console world. Dragon Ball fighting games were more popular, but RPGs were so much easier to develop on something as limited as the original Game Boy. So they created a new RPG series which got 2 games on this console, the Goku RPG. And Bandai wasn't just throwing RPGs to the side on the handheld consoles, or at least that wasn't the case yet. they stuck with the genre on the Super Nintendo, expanding their Gokuden series, taking it to the next level. So they started what ended up being a short-lived series called Super Gokuden. The combat was completely changed, the card system was completely scrapped off the game, they gave the players dialogue options to keep them engaged as the story progresses. The changes made were so significant that there was practically no trace of the previous Gokuden games. Unfortunately, these were the only 2 games that came out in that series. It vanished right after that because fans had decided what they wanted, and what they wanted was more fighting games. And so with the arrival of a new generation of consoles, the Butöden series kept evolving. The Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn happily received some Dragon Ball games. PlayStation was up first, and it started off on the wrong foot with Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22. As far as mechanics went, this game wasn't too different from the original Super Butöden games, but the fighting game genre had evolved at this point, and Ultimate Battle 22 looked as if it stayed still in time, making it a really bad fighting game. There was no evolution from the previous Super Butöden games. In fact, you could argue that some areas of the game actually looked worse than previously, like the backgrounds in which the fights took place. A short time afterwards, it was Sega Saturn's turn to get a Dragon Ball game, Dragon Ball Z Shin Butöden, and everyone could see that despite the game having a different name, this was basically the same game as Ultimate Battle 22. The character select screen was exactly the same, they recycled the sprites from the PlayStation game, so the main difference with this one is that it only came out in Japan. Dragon Ball Z Hyperdimension closed the Butöden series on the SNES. They made significant changes to the combat system that would not carry over to the rest of the games because at this point the world was moving on to newer consoles, leaving the Super Nintendo behind. But it was the first game in the franchise to have Kid Buu as a playable character. He still made it to the Super Nintendo. But everyone was looking at the Saturn and most of all looking at the PlayStation at this point. And these 2 consoles only had one game in common. That is, if you don't count Ultimate Battle and Shin Butöden, of course. And that game was unfortunately another failed experiment. It wasn't a part of the Butöden series, but it seemed to take some inspiration from the TurboGrafx game, Dragon Ball Z The Legend. The playstyle sure was unique. You had 2D sprites in a 3D environment, and you basically had to beat your opponent so much that the bar at the bottom would go in your favor, at which point you would unleash a meteor attack. Flying in the 3D space in a Dragon Ball game was something novel, but the game did end up being a little bit repetitive. Although it's worth noting that this was the first game to feature all the major Dragon Ball Z sagas, which made it very popular. It also included a few Easter eggs. For instance, if you let Frieza kill Krillin, Goku turns Super Saiyan. The game had really nice fan service, despite the poor gameplay. But the game that really blew up on this generation of consoles was of course Dragon Ball GT Final Bout. Dragon Ball Z had just premiered with its English dub in America, so there was a huge new audience jumping into Dragon Ball, and GT itself was wrapping up in Japan. But even if the people on the West weren't watching GT, they knew about it. And this game had some amazing graphics at the time. It was the first full 3D Dragon Ball game, and it had all the moves that you wanted. Ki Blast, the Kamehameha, the Final Flash. It lets you fly over the air. It lets you play as a Super Saiyan 4. So even if the game was completely broken in spots, a lot of fans still have fond memories of Final Bout because it allowed them to live that fantasy back when they were kids. It was the big breakthrough for Dragon Ball games on the PlayStation, the console that everyone had. But those weren't the only reasons why the game was so popular. We would not see another Dragon Ball game for another 5 years. So this was the most recent Dragon Ball game for a really long time. And if you think about it, it makes sense. After all, Dragon Ball GT was over. There was no more Dragon Ball on TV, and just like every other anime, once the show is over, the hype dies down and the video games stop. Except somehow, that wasn't the case with Dragon Ball. And it would take Bandai 5 years to realize that the hype was not dead. But that is a story for another time. Thank you for watching part 2 of our history and evolution of the Dragon Ball games. Catch the first part if you missed it by clicking the video up there, and if you're in the mood for something else, there's also the video at the bottom. But as always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Globku, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!